Allie Burnett is a wildlife researcher based here in Tucson now. She's a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Arizona, studying wildlife and human relationships throughout an urban gradient, kind of along the arroyos and with game cameras. And we're really excited for her to participate today and share all that she's learned and knows about wildlife and humans in the Tucson area. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Allie. And so folks, just logistically, please keep yourselves on mute. Feel free to chime into the chat if you have questions that occur throughout the presentation. We'll have some time at the end for an open discussion and questions, but feel free to put them in the chat or hold them until Allie finishes her presentation, and then we can open it up and address any of these questions. But without further ado, Allie.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eamon, and thank you guys so much for coming and attending my talk. Again, my name is Allie Burnett. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at University of Arizona, and today I just want to talk to you about living with urban wildlife. So when we live in cities, we often run into wildlife. Even though cities are made for and by humans, we often see them using our roads, sometimes raiding our gardens, and sometimes we even attract them to our yards. So what's happening here? We know that urban environments cause animals to change how they behave. And the biggest reason for that is because natural resources are replaced with artificial resources. So instead of eating what they normally would eat in the wild and sleeping where they normally would sleep, they're sort of forced to adjust and use our resources for that. And we also know that urban environments are expanding at an unprecedented rate, and a greater proportion of humans are now living in urban environments. So between those two things, we have a greater likelihood that humans and wildlife are going to overlap and potentially interact. And so we expect that in coming years that human-wildlife conflicts will likely increase. But there are a lot of benefits to living with urban wildlife. They provide population control in terms of if you have too many deer, you can get a lot of forage damage from too many deer feeding, so you get a browse line. You could also have too many rats or other non-native species that potentially carry diseases. And so we need predators for the population control. We also see urban wildlife helping out with pollination, seed dispersal, and plant recruitment. So helping our desert to look like a desert. But also, if you're like me and you're a gardener, you like to work in the back and grow your own food, we also rely on wildlife to pollinate our crops and our urban food. And then there's a growing number of studies that show that having green space nearby and interacting with wild animals has a lot of mental and physical health benefits. At the same time, there are costs to trying to eliminate wildlife. Obviously, we lose all of those ecosystem services, but there can also be a lot of unintended consequences. So for example, if we use rodenticide, we often see a buildup of rodenticide in predators like owls or coyotes, which can then cause sickness or death. We could also potentially accelerate evolution and lead to an evolutionary arms race. So in that same example with the rodenticide, we're seeing that some rodents can start to build resistance against that rodenticide. So what we end up with is a lot of rodents that are resistant to rodenticide, but no predators to keep them under control. So you can see how we sort of can create more problems by trying to eliminate wildlife. And of course, you decrease biodiversity, which helps increase resilience against climate change, but it also exacerbates the mass extinction. So we're currently witnessing the 6th mass extinction event, and the main driver of that is habitat loss. And so we need to try to support our local wildlife rather than trying to eliminate them. And so we most often see conflicts occurring when animals cannot meet their nutritional or caloric demands with natural resources alone. There are a lot of studies that show that animals preferentially use natural resources over anthropogenic resources. And it's only when that natural resource availability changes that we see increased pressure on those anthropogenic resources. And when I say anthropogenic resources, I just mean things like food, like pet food, bird seed, trash, but also things like our houses, our properties, underneath the decks, underneath the crawl space. Those are all anthropogenic resources. We also see animals more likely to consume or use those anthropogenic resources when they're sick or injured. And sometimes humans are the driving force behind this. So going back to rodenticide, when that rodenticide is left over in the rat's body, and then the coyote consumes the rat, they end up with a buildup of rodenticides in their system that over time can suppress their immune system, which can lead to diseases like mange that really limit their ability to move and to hunt. So if they can't hunt, then they're sort of forced to consume those anthropogenic resources, and we get this positive feedback loop. So given all of that, how can we coexist with wildlife in cities? Number one is preserving enough natural resources. And when I say that, I mostly mean native vegetation and topography. And we need that to support healthy wildlife populations so that we can relax pressure on anthropogenic resources and reduce spatial overlap between human and wildlife. And then another thing is that we need to prevent habituation by discouraging animals that use anthropogenic resources so that they don't see that as a viable option. And we can do that by using deterrent strategies, which in the animal behavior world, we refer to as aversive conditioning. And this will increase the cost of the behavior that we want to discourage. We'll talk about that more in just a few minutes. So we see the most success when we use behavioral ecology to inform our actions. And we do that by taking species ecology into account. So understanding how species respond to different environmental features and stimuli. One example of this might be canopy cover or shrub cover. So you can try to understand, do animals select for higher canopy cover, or do they select for higher shrub cover? Do they select against pavement? And a really good example of this is the Oracle Road wildlife crossing, where they collared animals to see where they were crossing the most. And then they built the crossing where the animals were already using and selecting for. And then they finished that crossing by placing plants that they knew and vegetation structure that they knew that the animals would select for. So that's a really good example of using behavioral ecology to inform wildlife management. And then we can also similarly try to understand how wildlife respond to lights, sounds, and smells. And that's important not only for understanding how we're disturbing them and potentially affecting their behavior, but it also helps inform us of how we could potentially influence their behavior. And just to, so another sort of aspect of this is taking behavioral principles into account. So when we see that discouraging behavior arise, that suggests that the benefits of performing that behavior outweighed the costs. And so in order to discourage that behavior, we should increase the cost of the behavior so that it's no longer beneficial for the animal to engage in that. And we can do this by making the behavior energetically or cognitively costly. So a great example of that is bear-safe containers, where it's very cognitively difficult for a bear to figure out how to open the container. So similarly, we can make it very difficult energetically or cognitively for animals to access our resources. And we can also potentially make it really risky, or at least have the perception of being risky. And we often do that by mimicking predator presence. And this is effective against both predators and prey animals because predators are territorial. So most animals on the landscape want to avoid predators. So things like putting down predator urine or yelling, making yourself look big and scary, those are all mimicking predator presence. And then, of course, we want to make sure that this conditioning sticks, that they don't habituate. And we do that by keeping our strategy consistent. So every time the behavior is exhibited, the animal is aversely conditioned against that behavior. You also want it to be dynamic, so not using the same strategy from the same position every single time. So maybe sometimes you spray with a hose and other times you throw gravel. Or if you have a loudspeaker that triggers promotion, you move the loudspeaker around so that it behaves more like an animal and sort of mimics an animal in that it's sort of random and dynamic. And then you want to be redundant. And what I mean by that is you want maybe an additional strategy that reinforces that signal so that the animal doesn't learn that, oh, that signal doesn't actually mean danger, and I can go ahead and do this behavior. So these owl decoys are a pretty good example of this. So we have the visual signal of this is an owl that animals know is dangerous, but we also have the owl also moves its head with a breeze, so it gives it kind of a random action, which makes it look more convincing as a real animal. And then bonus points if it also gives some noise, so that the animal is getting multiple signals that this really is an owl. And the great thing about this type of thing is that animals do interact with real owls all the time. And so the natural environment is continuously reinforcing that, yes, owl-shaped things do mean danger. So just keeping those things in mind when we're using that aversive conditioning can make sure that the animals don't habituate and that our conditioning is a lot more successful. So with all of that in mind, my project goals were generally to use behavioral ecology to assess human-wildlife relationships in Tucson and identify feasible solutions that not only reduce conflict, but also increase the urban wildlife health and biodiversity. And I use this, I took a three-pronged approach. So I had one portion assessing the frequency of human-wildlife conflict, one portion characterizing corridor use, and a third portion evaluating dietary changes resulting from urbanization. My three focal species were bobcat, javelina, and coyote. And that's because these three species make up a majority of the logs complaints in Tucson, as well as statewide. So even though a lot of us probably deal with pack rats and other animals that are more prolific, because they deal a lot less bodily damage, there tends to be a lot less complaints about them. So we see these guys pretty well represented in the complaint logs. So we want to try to mitigate that conflict and get those numbers down. So my main questions for each portion was which deterrent techniques currently promoted by the state government are most effective? What factors affect corridor use by coyote, javelina, and bobcat? And what proportion of coyote, javelina, and bobcat diet is composed of anthropogenic sources in Tucson? And we're a little bit limited on time today, so I'm just going to cover these first two questions. So starting with part one, assessing human-wildlife conflict and deterrent efficacy. So again, my question and overall goal is to determine which deterrent strategies are most effective. And to do this, I distributed a public survey to Tucson residents. This might look familiar to you if you've taken that survey. And that was to help me assess the conflicts and understand which tactics people are using and whether they were effective on an immediate and long-term basis. So my online survey focused again on bobcat, javelina, and coyote. And I asked whether they had seen the animal in their property, whether they had attempted to deter the animal or not, their reasons for deterring, which deterrent strategy they used. And for those, I pulled from Arizona Game and Fish's website and used only those strategies. And then, of course, did the animal leave and have you seen the animal since? Getting at that short and long-term efficacy, and then their attitudes towards each species. So getting into our results, overwhelmingly positive attitudes towards all three species. But we did see some negative and neutral attitudes, and the javelina in particular had slightly more negative responses than the other two species. So these are just this is a flow chart of the responses to show you how people responded. Generally, most people did not attempt to deter coyotes that they saw in their property. But of those that did, they generally had success by yelling, that got coyotes to leave 80% of the time. And for long-term success, they waving objects and installing a barrier seem to be fairly effective. For bobcat, again, not a lot of people attempted to deter bobcats, but of those that did, yelling at the bobcat was extremely effective, both short and long term. And I want to just point out here, so here's, you can see that securing resources was not very effective, although we only got one response. But here, bobcats aren't necessarily going after your pet food or your trash or anything like that. Mostly bobcats in Tucson are using the houses as places to raise their kittens, or they're using the native vegetation as cover to move through. So the reason why securing resources might not work for bobcats is because the house itself or the property itself is the resource. And then for javelina, we did see more people attempting to deter, but most people could get the javelina to leave their property immediately by spraying water and throwing gravel were especially effective, but also making yourself big and scary and waving objects was also moderately effective. Getting javelina to, rather deterring javelina long-term can be a bit more tricky, but barriers did seem to have some effect. And this one person did opt to translocate the javelina. I don't recommend doing that, but that was successful in that circumstance. So our study conclusions, overall, Tucson residents generally have positive attitudes towards these three species. And we see fairly low levels of conflict. Only 10 to 20% of residents are attempting to deter the animal. And then behavioral deterrent strategies were largely effective at preventing future conflicts, both short and long term. But importantly, some strategies are more effective for some species than others. So let's just go through these really quick. So again, coyotes, the most effective short-term deterrent was yelling and making loud noises. The most effective long-term deterrent was installing a barrier. And just a side note, if you are off of your property and walking your dog and a coyote starts to follow you, that this is called escorting behavior. What's happening is they probably see your dog as a threat and they just want you to leave the area. So just remain calm and continue walking and just leave the area as quickly as possible. They might have a den nearby with coyote pups that they don't want your dog near. And here I really like to think of it as a two-way street. So when coyotes are in our yard, we can communicate with them that they are a threat and we don't want them around. And we hope that they listen to that. And in the same way, when we are in a coyote territory, they communicate with us that we are a threat and they don't want us around. And ideally, we should heed those communication signals and listen and leave. So those are more coyote-specific ways to avoid conflicts with coyotes. And then for bobcat, the most effective short and long-term was yelling. And that's because bobcats really, they're pretty shy. They don't really like to be around humans. So it can be really effective to simply look directly at them and yell at them to deter them. The other thing I want to say is that barriers didn't necessarily work for bobcats because bobcats are great climbers. So if there's a tree anywhere near the property, they can easily get over the fence. But again, they're probably not going for your particular resources. They're going for the house or the vegetation. And then for javelina, the most effective short-term deterrent was spraying with a hose or throwing gravel. And the most effective long-term deterrent was a barrier or partial barrier. And a partial barrier often means like a cactus barrier. Just keep in mind that if it's a prickly pear barrier, they might end up eating it. But and then this wasn't addressed necessarily in the survey, but you might have luck with deterring javelina from your property by applying an unpalatable substance to the plants to deter them from eating it so that it doesn't taste good. So something like lime or cayenne. Another big thing is waiting until the morning of trash pickup to take trash bins out to the curb. So if everyone puts the trash bins out the night before, you can really smell, the smell sort of can waft around to the washes where the javelina are at, and then they're attracted to the neighborhood. And they have all night to feed on this trash while everyone's sleeping. And so there's nobody to deter the behavior. So it's really better to minimize that opportunity and minimize the opportunity for habituation and wait until morning. And then, of course, javelina are very defensive. They breed year round, so they almost always have babies with them. And, you know, I'm sure any parent can relate, you know, you got to keep your baby safe. So they get really defensive, especially around dogs. So it's definitely in everyone's best interest to give them a lot of space. And then just more generally, for all wildlife, we never want to feed wildlife because that can lead to habituation and dependence, which leads to aggression. And then, of course, you have increased conflict in general around the area, but you could also end up needing to euthanize the animal. So it ends up being unfavorable for both us and the wildlife. And then keep pets under close supervision, of course, especially between dusk and dawn. Our Tucson coyotes tend to hunt in the early morning hours, right around dawn. So you want to make sure that your pets are inside and safe during those hours. If you have livestock, if you have urban chickens or rabbits, ensure that they are kept in secure housing overnight with no possible points of entry. And then, of course, keep any sort of perishables, pet food, birdseed, etc., secured in animal-proof containers. Avoid use of rodenticides. We talked about that. And then translocation and removal should really only be used as a last resort if the animal is threatening physical harm. And the reason for that is because translocations well, so let me start up. So a recent review of North American translocations found that a vast majority of them ended mortality. And so what often ends up happening is we are simply transferring the conflict to another person. Often they get hit by a car or because they can't navigate around the area as well, they don't necessarily know where the food and the water is. So they end up getting hit. And then what you have is somebody now has a dead animal and vehicle damage and potentially personal injury resulting from that translocation. Okay, so moving on to the next part, characterizing corridor use. This was a major driver of my PhD. So I'm from Michigan, so I am not familiar at all with dry washes. And I was really fascinated by these washes in Tucson and how they just seemed like perfect wildlife corridors in order to allow animals to move through the city while avoiding all of that traffic. So I really wanted to know, A, whether wildlife were using them, B, which washes were best for wildlife. And we know from previous studies that coyotes and javelina are using these washes as travel corridors, but I was really surprised that there really hasn't been any other research or anything focusing just on the washes. So my main question was, which environmental features best predict wildlife use of urban and suburban washes? And to do this, I deployed an array of wildlife cameras around the city to monitor space use along riparian corridors. So this is a map of all of my cameras. I had about 80 total. And for this analysis, I'm leaving out the Santa Cruz because it's an intermittent stream, and so I'm only doing ephemeral streams, just because that water flow might make a difference in my models. And then here is a picture of my camera setup. I've got a Bushnell camera with a Python locking cable around it. And here it was at Bear Canyon. You may have seen it. All of my cameras were placed off trail, but almost all of my cameras had humans on them. So I mentioned the word ephemeral and intermittent. So just to tell you guys what this means. So rivers come in 3 flavors. They can be either ephemeral, intermittent, or perennial. Perennial is probably what you're most familiar with. They're connected to the water table throughout the year. They flow year round. Whereas ephemeral streams are disconnected from the water table. So they only flow in response to precipitation and snow melt. And these make up about 95% of waterways in Arizona and 50% of waterways around the globe. And that's because a lot of headstreams are ephemeral and a lot of streams in arid lands are ephemeral. And unfortunately, we're seeing an increase in ephemeral streams as perennial and intermittent streams dry up. And then intermittent streams are connected to the water table intermittently, spatially and temporally. So flow varies based on the water table depth. And the Santa Cruz River is a classic example of intermittent stream. So just to keep our results all consistent, I focus on Tucson's ephemeral streams. And even though we often think of these rivers as sort of dead or empty, they're absolutely really valuable habitat, regardless of flow, all throughout the year. So, of course, when they're flowing, they can be a water source, but even when they dry up, sometimes you'll still have pools that can function as a water source. And they also provide habitat for riparian specialists. So, there's a lot of difference in vegetation as you get taller trees, more shrubs, more forbs. And so there are some species that rely on that type of vegetation and can't live outside of that. And so we have a number of species here in Tucson that really can only live in those riparian areas, that we don't see them out in the desert. So this is really valuable habitat for them. It also offers a cooler microclimate as well as protection from the sun. So even those upland animals will come into the wash during the heat of the day, especially in the peak of the summer, because that wash is really protecting them from the heat and the sun. And then, of course, it's a really nice travel corridor in that there's no vegetation and there's no water. So you basically just have a nice corridor for you to travel along. And then it also offers food source. So if there's water there, you can find aquatic insects and larvae in the water, as well as fish. But also, even when it's dry, the area has native vegetation and habitat for prey animals that things like coyotes and bobcats can prey on. So really, really important habitat. I placed my cameras in a variety of washes with different vegetation structure, different wash width, and across a gradient of urbanness to try to understand which of these washes was most attractive to wildlife. So for my analysis, I looked at a few different metrics. I looked at species richness, community composition, species occupancy, which just means presence, whether the species was there or not, as well as species abundance, which I'll refer to as frequency. So that was measured by calculating the number of observations over the total number of days that the camera was deployed. So it's basically a rate or a frequency, but what I want you to think of it as is the degree to which the species is using the wash. So how heavy is that use, or how often do they come and use that wash? And then for my explanatory variables that I explored and tested, I looked at impervious surface across a number of scales because I wanted to understand at what scale does impervious surface start to affect animals. And when I say impervious surface, that just means things like pavement, buildings, anything that water can't penetrate. So I looked at that across a variety of scales. And then I also looked at shrub cover and tree cover at a very small scale to try to characterize just that camera site. I looked at the distance to the second wash, so it's a Euclidean distance to the nearest wash, any wash that an animal could potentially access. And that's a metric of connectivity. And then human abundance, which again was really frequency, number of observations over effort at that camera site. So how often I saw humans at that camera site. And then the width of the wash. And just to control for my effort, I also included variables for year and the nights deployed. So here are my results. So for native species richness, and this is looking just at mammals, and particularly medium-sized mammals, because that was what my camera was positioned to get. So if we want to understand where we find the most native mammals, human abundance, impervious surface, and camera placement were the biggest predictors. And there was a negative effect for both human abundance and impervious surface, which means that as those metrics increase, we see a decrease in species richness. So they don't do as well, or we don't see as many species where we see high impervious surface or high human abundance. And then we also saw more species in our main channel as well as on the upland area compared to the floodplain. So that's just showing you that the main channel is different from the floodplain in that it's getting more species, and probably species are using it as a travel corridor. And then effort is important to include just to control, and it shows a logical relationship. The more days that the camera is out, the more species we see. We expect that. Here's just a visualization of what that looks like for impervious surface. So you can see that our native mammal richness declines as our impervious surface increases. And then a similar chart for relative abundance of humans. So again, as we increase the abundance of humans, we see a decrease in mammal richness. And this one weird point right here is Saguaro National Park West. Again, all of my cameras were off trail, but this camera was pretty close to a parking lot in a wash, and people tended to go into the wash instead of in the opposite direction where the designated trail was. So we got a lot of people using that trail. And we also see lower species richness there compared to our other Saguaro National Park cameras are way up here at the top. So that's just what that outlier is. So community composition, these orbs just represent each community. And you can see that the suburban and rural wildlife communities are fairly similar. I was actually pretty impressed that the suburban areas were able to maintain a relatively similar community. The big things that you lose out on in the suburbs is mountain lions, which I'm sure you guys are happy about, and mule deer. But other than that, they mostly have the same species. You'll still get, of course, coyote, badger, javelina, skunks, badgers, gray foxes, all those good things. And then our urban community was a bit different. So we saw a lot more cats, dogs, humans in that community compared to the suburban and rural. So looking specifically at bobcat presence and frequency, we saw a big effect of impervious surface at a 1 kilometer squared scale, as well as human abundance. So they both had a negative effect on the likelihood of a bobcat being at that site or not. And then we also saw a decrease in the year 2022 compared to 2021. So what that means is that we saw bobcats at fewer sites at 2022 than 2021. And then for their frequency, and again, this is sort of like the degree of use of the wash, human abundance and the distance to a second wash both had a large negative effect. And I forgot to say this, the arrow is, the size of the arrow is representative of the magnitude of the effect. Um, so human abundance had a large negative effect on bobcat abundance, and distance to second wash had a somewhat smaller effect, but still negative. And then year and effort both showed a positive effect. And if you're a little bit confused by the year, so what this means is that even though we saw bobcats at fewer sites in 2022 compared to 2021, where we did see them, we saw them at a higher rate in 2022. So their frequency increased, but we lost them at some sites. And here's just a quick and dirty heat map of where we're seeing the most bobcat activity. So the lighter colors, the warmer colors represent more activity, and the cooler colors represent relatively less activity. And there are some cameras that don't even show up, where we didn't get bobcats at all towards the center of the city. Oops. So here's just a graphical representation of what that looks like. So our likelihood of seeing a bobcat at a site had a negative relationship with this human abundance here. You can see it's pretty steep relationship there. And then with 1 kilometer square impervious surface over here. So again, a negative relationship, not quite as steep though. For our coyotes, we saw that shrubs and impervious surface were the largest predictors. I'm sorry, that top model is incorrect. I apologize for that. But shrub and impervious surface were the largest predictors. Shrub had a positive effect, so coyotes are seeking shrubs out. They prefer more shrub cover, and they prefer less impervious surface. But note that this is on a smaller scale, so 500 meters squared instead of 1 kilometer squared. So they're more okay with having pavement surrounding them as long as it's not in the immediate vicinity. And then they also selected for smaller wash channels. So as the wash width increased, we saw a decrease in the likelihood of coyote presence. And then here we saw an increase in coyote, in the number of sites with coyote. For frequency, again, distance to that second wash was a significant predictor, and that was a negative relationship. So the further the wash, the less likely you are to see a coyote. And then a positive relationship with both year and effort. So we saw an increase in coyotes in 2022, both in terms of the number of sites and also in terms of how often they visited those sites. And here's a heat map of what that looks like visually, where the coyotes are at. Still avoiding, or well, not avoiding, but they're still not super frequent here in the center of the city where my cameras were at, but they are there, whereas the bobcats weren't there at all. And then here's a visual representation of those relationships. So you can see that much of the lower impervious surface, this is a standardized scale, but these are all lower. The left side of the graph is lower impervious surface. And it's really not until you get up into the 40, 50, 60% impervious surface that you see this really steep relationship. And then on the right here, we have the distance to an additional wash against coyote abundance. And you can see there's a negative relationship there. And then finally for javelina. So our impervious surface and human abundance both had large negative effects on the probability of javelina presence. And again, we saw an increase in the year 2022 compared to 2021. And for their frequency, tree coverage was important for predicting how often javelina used the wash, as well as effort and year. And again, for javelina, like coyote, we saw an increase in both the number of sites and how often they use those sites. So here you can see how probability of occupancy for javelina slightly decreases with human abundance, not nearly as steep as that relationship with that bobcats had. And then similarly with impervious surface, and here we're on a 2 kilometer squared scale. So they are a lot less sensitive to that impervious surface, or sorry, they're a lot more sensitive to that impervious surface. And here's a heat map of them. So we mostly see them more towards the mountains, at least in the washes. So our study conclusions were impervious surface significantly influences wildlife richness and species presence. It affected all 3 focal species, but each were affected at slightly different scales. And coyote appeared to be the least sensitive or the most tolerant of impervious surface because they had that relatively small scale of influence. And then we saw that high human activity in washes may deter many species, including bobcats and javelina, from using those washes. And then vegetation cover, particularly tree cover, facilitated use of washes by javelina, whereas connectivity or the distance between washes facilitated bobcat and coyote use. More generally, for implications for managing the wildlife corridors, it might be beneficial then to limit or reduce pavement and building footprints within a 1 kilometer radius around those ephemeral streams, particularly where high species richness is desired. Creating and maintaining dedicated trails for humans to use and educational signs, I think, would be helpful so that people understand that this is habitat that animals are using and that your presence does affect their ability to use that habitat. And for us personally, as a takeaway, we can all try to use dedicated trails when walking in washes. And then finally, restoring and preserving ephemeral stream beds to increase connectivity and facilitate movement of bobcats and coyote without the use of roads. So we really don't want them to rely on the roads to move through the city. We want them to use the washes to limit the likelihood of getting hit by a vehicle. So the overall take-home message, there are many things that humans can do to adjust our own behavior and surroundings that can reduce human-wildlife conflict. And thinking from the perspective of the animal and working with their natural behavior can inform management solutions and reduce conflicts, but also increase access to the benefits of those ecosystem services. And then finally, we must work within the frame of evolution and ecology to address these problems. So with that, I just want to thank all of my partners, particularly the Tucson residents everybody, but Tucson residents that took the survey, allowed me to put cameras in their properties, and just the general support of the Tucson population has been really special and really great. And then, of course, all of my other professional partners, Pima County, the City of Tucson, Arizona Game and Fish, National Park, a lot of faculty at University of Arizona that helped me get through all of the permitting process and analysis. And then, of course, my lab mates and my research assistants for helping me along the way. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Allie. A really interesting presentation and fascinating to hear how wildlife are using the landscape in Tucson. For folks in the Zoom meeting, feel free to either put questions in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask directly. And so we've got a question here coming in. Do you have any numbers or statistics to understand how much harm rodenticides are causing to predators?
Unfortunately, I don't have any numbers on that for Tucson, but there are a number of studies that were done in California and Colorado that look more at that, but I don't have any numbers for Tucson in particular. Sorry about that.
Okay. And then the next question is a clarifying question, whether or not your human abundance measurement was kind of the human use of the washes as captured by the cameras.
Yes. So yeah, it was just like, it was measured the same way that the bobcat, coyote, and javelina abundance was. So yes, it's a measure of how the humans are using the washes, how often we see them.
Great. I had a question with the power or the influence of impervious surface affecting negatively all of these species and the mechanism behind that. Do you think it's directly the impervious surface and limiting access to substrate, or is it more of a surrogate for like human density? When you have more
Mhm.
impervious surface, you have more people. Do you have thoughts on that relationship?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's probably a bit of both, and it's
Okay,
really hard to tease it apart because
sure.
everything's correlated.
Yeah,
Um, but I think that probably the human aspect of it is the most influential. If there were no humans, they probably would be more likely to use that paved surface.
sure.
But of course, just in general, paved surfaces have little use and other than
Mhm.
travel. So we still probably would see a negative effect.
Great, thank you. We had another question come in, just wondering if you were connected with Cheryl Mollahan and I think the Bobcats in Tucson project. And
Yes.
yeah,
Yep. I'm working with Cheryl and the Bobcats in Tucson team. They are collecting bobcat hair for me so that
okay,
I can do stable isotope analysis to understand what the bobcats are eating and what proportions.
great.
They've been
Thank you.
great.
Yeah, really great photos. Um, Question coming in, what was the size of your data set? I, I think there's a lot of ways to answer that. Do you mean like size of number of photos, maybe, perhaps?
Yeah, so a number of photos is probably in the hundreds of thousands. Had a lot of photos, but I had about this analysis was 62 cameras, and it was over the course of 2 years. So from 2020 to or sorry, from the beginning of 2021 to the end of 2022 was the data set that I analyzed. Hopefully that answers your question. For the survey, my data set was about, I had about 300 responses.
Okay, 300 responses. That's great. A lot of participation. We've got one more question coming in. I live in the urban core in Tucson. Any recommendations for increasing wildlife habitat in urban areas
Hmm.
without increasing conflict? Love to
Mhm.
see these animals, but don't want them in danger.
Yeah, and that's a tricky one because there's not really any natural habitat for them. And so if you don't want to like put a lot of native vegetation on your yard and then bother your neighbors with all of the javelina that are coming in to nest in your shrubs. So, I mean, it can be difficult. There's certainly, you can certainly at least cater to the smaller animals. So you can put native vegetation that birds like, and you could even put out like sunning rocks and things for lizards. But for getting the larger animals in urban areas, I think it's better to do things like restore Arroyo Chico. And wouldn't it be cool if we had a bike path along Arroyo Chico the same way and sort of expand that buffer around Arroyo Chico so that that is native natural habitat that the wildlife can use, but it's still close to where you're at. So you aren't super far from those ecosystem services and from that wildlife viewing, but those wildlife aren't in your yard. Hopefully that helps. It's tricky.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. We have another question on the technical side of things. Just wondering if you processed photos manually or if you used any machine learning or algorithms.
Yeah, I did it manually, and the big reason there is because the AI software that I had access to is not trained very well on southwestern species. So every javelina was a pig.
Mhm.
So I ended up needing to do it manually.
One day they'll learn what a
Right.
javelina is.
Right. Hopefully.
So, Eamon, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Allie, I had occasion to drive west on Camino de Cierro, and there's a brand new, there was a brand new housing tract up there.
Hmm.
And they put the trash out on the street the night before pickup, and the trash is just all over the place, gobs and gobs and gobs. And I note your comments on that, but they need to be taught before they put it out, because these are brand new residents, probably from another state. And
Mhm.
what a mess that was. I've got photos of it too, but so how do you get out there and teach them well ahead of the time? When they first move in, the very next week, they're going to be putting their trash out. So
Mhm.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I think in general, a better, um, if more people knew about not putting your trash out the night before, maybe neighbors can help spread the word, and let them know that, hey, you're gonna attract javelina. You could also try to have city ordinances to try to regulate that sort of behavior. Honestly, I wish people got like a PDF file when they first moved here that gives them all of the information of what it means to live in Tucson. But it's tricky to get to educate people, especially people from out of state.
That PDF idea of yours is fine. How would you even know when they're starting to move in?
Right. You
You've
would,
got to be connected to the home builders, I guess, to the
yeah, or the real estate agents,
yeah.
have them distribute to new residents coming in.
Okay, so nothing has been instigated in this regard
No,
to
I don't think that there's any, I may be mistaken, but to my knowledge, there's really no process in terms of trying to educate transplants that move in.
We have a suggestion in the chat that it could be on the waste collection companies. Kind of, they give you the what's recyclable and not, and they could also
Mhm.
give you a sticker either right on the trash container that says, "Hey, mind your manners. Don't don't don't
That's a great
feed
idea.
javelina."
That's a
Yeah,
great idea. Putting it right on the trash can. I like that.
yeah.
some of those
HOAs.
stickers, some of the stickers at Home Depot and Lowe's where they're selling the big trash cans.
Yeah.
That might work too. And you can do that.
Hey, Joe, I think we
But
got a
then
new
they have,
campaign for you.
I'm busy, but it was just disgusting when I saw this. It's just something should be done about that. Because
Mhm.
all that trash will wash downward down the canyon from where the housing tract is.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Okay.
Allie, I had one more question on the kind of results of the models and the distance to nearest washes. It was, just to make sure I understand it, it was the farther away another wash was, the less likely you were to see animals. And is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Yep, that's correct.
What, and do you think that's just simply a relate, like you said, connectivity? When washes are more isolated, they have less use.
Yeah, I think
Right.
that they really prefer to use washes. And so if there's no washes available,
Gotcha.
then yeah, they're sort of stuck.
Right. Great. We have another minute or two. If there's any lingering questions, feel free to ask. Um, Otherwise, this recording will be available on our website by the end of the day or maybe early tomorrow. We can always email me directly or keep an eye on our webpage. We'll put it up. But please thank Allie for her time and this wonderful research. And yeah, have a great day. Thanks for participating.
And thank you all for attending. I really appreciate the attention and the interest.